Today's episode is brought to you by the Daily Gardener Friday newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about garden history and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is October 4th. Today in garden history, it was on this day, October 4th in 1853, that Henry David Thoreau wrote in his journal these words: "The maples are reddening and birches yellowing. The mouse ear in the shade in the middle of the day looks as if the frost still lay on it. Bumblebees are on the aster and gnats are dancing in the air." Well, the mouse ear that Thoreau is mentioning in this excerpt is actually a species of forget-me-not. It's known as the tufted forget-me-not or the bay forget-me-not or just simply the small-flowered forget-me-not, and it likes to grow in wet areas. So I can believe that there was still frost on this forget-me-not when Thoreau was looking at it, especially because of the fact that it was probably in a low-lying or damp area. Now, Thoreau himself went into a little more detail about the mouse ear's forget-me-not. That's what he referred to it as. And here's what he wrote about it. He wrote, "The mouse ear forget-me-not. It's one of the most interesting, minute flowers, and it is the more beautiful for being small and unpretending." And then I love how he ends this. He writes, "Even flowers must be modest." Classic Thoreau there. But it also underscores this point of agreement that I have with longtime gardeners. And that is that the longer we garden, we come to appreciate some of the more subtle or smaller details in a much bigger way than we did when we were first starting out. We mature in our perspective on our gardens or on different plants or species of plants in our gardens. Our thinking evolves and changes, and what we love about our garden grows as we mature as gardeners. Well, another piece of garden history for today is the death of Mary Hiester Reid, the American-born Canadian painter and teacher. She died on this day, October 4th, in 1921. A painter of floral still lifes, Mary was a tonalist. This means she was passionate, she was poetic and subtle in her paintings, and that's why her works have been called devastatingly expressive. In her career, Mary was both an impressionist and a realist. Mary produced over 300 oil paintings during her career, and in her prime, in 1890, Mary was regarded as the most important flower painter in Canada. Mary often painted trios, so her paintings would feature 3 flowers or 3 trees, for example. And the author Molly Peacock offers additional insight into Mary's work with trios and triangulation as a reflection of what was going on in her own life. Molly writes, "Mary and her husband lived in a loose menage with a talented younger artist named Mary Evelyn Wrench. Now, Mary was both Mary Hiester Reid's friend, but also a rival painter, and she was also 24 years her junior." And I also found this little tidbit when I was researching Mary. When she died, in her will, Mary specified that her husband was to go to Mary Evelyn Wrench. Make of that what you will. Well, Mary's death so moved a Canadian newspaper man named Duncan Sutherland McCorquodale that he felt compelled to write a memorial poem in her honor. Now, the verse I'm about to read refers to Mary's Witchwood home. And Witchwood was an artist's enclave of 60 homes that was tucked into the rolling wooded hills of the Davenport Ridge in Toronto. And by the way, this was not the first artist community that Mary and George had lived in. They lived in a number of them, both in Paris and in New York. They lived in Auntie Aura. Anyway, here's this little excerpt from Duncan's beautiful tribute to Mary Hiester Reid, flower painter extraordinaire, realist, impressionist, and tonalist, someone who painted with emotion. Free from the thrall called life, palette and brush laid down, off with achievement's strife, donned the immortal's crown. Yet hovers she near, 'neath the witchwood tree. This, the roses she painted, tell to me. Well, in September of last year, Molly Peacock's fabulous book on Mary Hiester Reid was published, and it's called Flower Diary, in which Mary Hiester Reid paints, travels, marries, and opens a door. I put a link to the book in today's show notes. It sells for around $29 on Amazon. And I also happened to stumble on a marvelous talk that Molly Peacock gave, and I will put a link to that in the Facebook group for the show. So if you want to check that out, just head on over to Facebook and search for Daily Gardener Community, and you'll find a link to the video there. And it was also on this day, October 4th, in 1926, that the dahlia was officially designated as San Francisco's city flower. The Dahlia Society of California had been founded almost a decade earlier, and the club was responsible for getting the city to embrace the beautiful dahlia as its own. And I found a little newspaper clipping of their efforts to persuade the city leaders, and I thought it was just precious, and I wanted to share it with you. But here's what it said. The desks in the headquarters of the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco burst into bloom yesterday when the Dahlia Society of California presented a petition asking for the dahlia's appointment as the official flower of San Francisco. And as the city's official flower, the dahlia will win worldwide notice for San Francisco in the same manner that the rose has for Portland, Oregon. And as the petition was read, women armed with great bouquets of giant dahlias distributed the colorful blossoms among the listening supervisors. And the head supervisor, James B. McSheehy, was surrounded by an enormous bower of blooms. And so that, my friend, is how the dahlia became San Francisco's official flower. And since 1926, dahlias can be seen in peak bloom at the Dahlia Dell in Golden Gate Park in August, a month known as the foggiest, grayest month of the year in San Francisco. Now, to get to the Dahlia Dell, if you want to see it, you just head east past the Conservatory of Flowers just inside the Golden Gate Park. The garden is still maintained by volunteers from the Dahlia Society of California, which also holds, by the way, an annual Dahlia and Tuber sale and an annual 2-day Dahlia show. Now, I know what you might be thinking, and you're right. As for the beautiful dahlia, it's also the official flower of Seattle, the city of destiny and goodwill. But it might surprise you to learn that the dahlia was initially grown as a food crop. It turns out that the tubers are edible, and they taste a little like other root vegetables. Think of the potato or the carrot. Now, the dahlia, of course, was named to honor the Swedish botanist Anders Dahl, and dahlias are in the same family as daisies and sunflowers. Dahlia blossoms come in all shapes and sizes. Some are as large as dinner plates. And of course, this time of year, us gardeners are preparing for the cold weather. And this means that if you are growing dahlias, once you've had your first frost, that's the sign you're waiting for to go out into the garden and dig up your dahlia tubers and get them stored for next spring. Now, if you don't know how to do that, it's really quite simple. All you need to do is, once your tubers are out of the ground, I just kind of brush them off a little bit, remove any extra soil, and then you can put them in a basket or a container that's full of perlite. And I just kind of tuck them down in there and then go ahead and store them on a cool, dark shelf in a basement storage room or in your garage, provided it doesn't get too cold. But that perlite is wonderful because it keeps the tubers dry and it also allows them to breathe. And so that's my favorite method for storing dahlia tubers. But now I also wanted to share something that I read by the Empress of Dirt, Melissa J. Will. She shared this advice in her newsletter that I subscribed to a few years ago, and I thought this was also excellent. Melissa wrote, "Every enthusiastic dahlia grower will tell you that their storage method works like a charm, and they are right for their specific conditions. The point is, it's the health of the tuber and the overall environment that counts the most." And then she writes, "The optimum storage temperature is 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and we run into problems when the heating systems in our homes make the humidity level far too low for the tubers. So Melissa advises using plastic food wrap, where each tuber is wrapped individually in plastic wrap to keep the moisture in." And she writes, "Growers who use this method, using that plastic wrap, report a higher number of viable tubers each spring." So go ahead and give that a try too, if that intrigues you, if that's something you're interested in, using Melissa's plastic wrap method. And then she also goes on to mention a few other points here. She says, "Remember that exposure to some cold is necessary for the tuber to develop each year." So she says, wait until the early frosts have turned the foliage black before digging up the tubers and then storing them for the winter. And then she writes, in the spring, a good handy rule is that if it's the right time to plant tomatoes, it's the right time to plant dahlias. So link those two in your mind. It's got to be nice and hot out. And then finally, Melissa gives this other little piece of advice that is something else to pay attention to if deer are an issue in your area. Melissa writes that dahlia are not entirely deer-proof, but they're also not the first choice for deer. So hopefully they will leave your dahlia alone. Now, they may not leave your hostas alone. That's like eating a salad to them. That's their favorite thing. They love that. But apparently for the dahlias to be eaten, those deer have to be pretty hungry, pretty desperate before they're going to eat dahlias. So great tips from the Empress of Dirt. Now, if you are looking for a good book on dahlias, I've got a great recommendation for you. I wanted to quickly mention that you should consider Dahlias by Naomi Slade. I know I've recommended this book on a previous episode, but it is one of my favorite books on dahlias. It's a great gift book. This is a book that came out in 2018. The subtitle is Beautiful Varieties of Dahlias for Home and Garden. And what's wonderful about this book is that if you love dahlias, this is a dahlia eye candy book. You will fully appreciate all the different varieties of dahlias that exist. There are just so many. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting about Naomi is she is a biologist by training, but she's a naturalist by inclination. She has a lifelong love of plants, And then, of course, for this book, I think one of the things that clearly makes it a standout is that Naomi partnered with Georgiana Lane, one of the top garden photographers in the world. And so you end up with this beautiful, beautiful book. And the cover, by the way, is absolutely gorgeous. The cover shows this orangey, apricot-y looking dahlia. And so I've always thought if you have decor where that is your complementary color, that book would look fantastic sitting out on a shelf or on display. It's just a beautiful color, a beautiful book, just absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous book. And it is 240 pages of dahlias. And you can also get a copy of it on Amazon. I just checked, and there are used copies. So you can get a nice used copy of this book right now for about $10 or less. So that's a great deal. And I'll put a link to that in today's show notes as well. All right. And then for our last little piece of garden history, we are going to the recent past. It was on this day, October 4th in 2020, so just 2 years ago, that the rarest fern in Europe was discovered in Ireland. Now, I don't know if you remember this story, but it was discovered in Killarney, this little fern, and it was a variety that was only known to grow in the Caribbean. So they were accustomed to finding it in the cloud forest of Jamaica, in Cuba, in the Dominican Republic. But then scientists could just not figure out how this particular little tiny fern could be growing in Ireland. It's called the Kerry Mousetail Fern. What an adorable little name. But over time, what scientists believe happened is that the tiny spores of this fern were carried on the wind thanks to a Caribbean hurricane and then ended up in Ireland. Isn't that something? It's hard to believe that those tiny little spores could travel that far. They say something like 6,000 kilometers, but they are so little, so tiny. And speaking of how tiny these little fern spores are, coincidentally, there is a fun little piece of Irish folklore that says that if you're able to collect fern seeds, what they called fern seeds, those little spores, then you would be able to have the power of invisibility. So there you go. Incentive to collect fern spores. A little Irish plant folklore. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, The Amish Friends 4 Seasons Cookbook by Wanda E. Bronstetter. This book came out in April of this year. I remember when I was looking through Amazon at the latest cookbook releases, and I happened to stumble on Wanda's cookbook. And here's how Wanda introduces this cookbook to us. She writes, "Do you strive to eat what is local, fresh, and in season? Then this is the cookbook for you. Organized by winter, spring, summer, and fall seasons, there are a bounty of recipes for various ways to use seasonal fruits and vegetables, sprinkled with tips for growing and harvesting too. And in this cookbook, Wanda has managed to collect recipes from Amish and Mennonite families from all across the United States." So very intriguing. And Wanda is a gardener. It's worth noting that. She writes that she and her husband have a mid-sized garden. So she's got some gardening chops, but she also recommends leveraging your local farmer's market or maybe some farm stands, especially if you're not able to grow all of your own produce. And many of us fall into that category, even as gardeners. Well, I just want to speak a little off the cuff here about about Wanda's book because it's really the kind of cookbook that I feel would get passed down in my family or in my husband's family. This is exactly the kind of cookbook that would get put together for a family reunion, and then all of us would pitch in $20 and get a copy of it or something like that. That's what Wanda's cookbook reminds me of. It's got all of these sweet little images and Bible verses, of course. And then the recipes are clearly family friendly. They're family favorites. So it's hard not to fall in love with them. I thought I'd read this little snippet from Midwest Book Review to give you an idea of what's in this cookbook. James writes, recipes range from coconut peach dessert, green tomato relish, chicken dumplings and fruit parfait, to peanut butter popcorn, barbecue meatballs, buttery onion soup, that sounds good for tonight, and homemade tater tots. Sounds fantastic, doesn't it? Well, I also should mention that Wanda's cookbook has a very nice lay flat spiral binding, which comes in very handy when you're following a recipe. And I also think that this cookbook would be the perfect hostess gift for the holidays. You could bring it to your Thanksgiving celebration or use it as a Christmas gift. Say, for instance, you're doing a Secret Santa gift exchange and your gifts need to be under $20. Well, if that's the case, Wanda's book would be perfect. This book is 224 pages of over 200 recipes for eating with the seasons. You can get a copy of Wanda E. Bronstetter's Amish Friends 4 Seasons Cookbook by Wanda E. Bronstetter and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $12. Sweet little cookbook. All right, we end the show today with a botanic spark that celebrates the birthday of Dorothy Frances Blomfield Gurney, the English hymn writer and poet. She was born on this day, October 4th, in 1858. Today, many gardeners have forgotten this charming little verse that Dorothy wrote many, many moons ago, and yet you'll see this verse still today in so many gardens. And it goes like this. The kiss of the sun for pardon, the song of the birds for mirth. One is nearer God's heart in a garden than anywhere else on earth. Well, that's it for today's show. Sweet way to end the show today. I hope you get a chance to spend some time in your garden today. Probably got to get a little cleanup done before that first frost. And just a reminder that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. The next time you're over at Facebook, just search for Daily Gardener Community, where you'd search for a friend and then request to join. And if you'd like more of The Daily Gardener, you can subscribe to the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. And don't forget that you can also show your support for the show by using the Buy Me a Coffee link over at the website or in today's show notes. This is Jennifer Ebling. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day.